All right. Welcome. Here in the back, let's go ahead and take our seats and we'll get started with our Bible class here. Good to see everybody. Good to see those back from camp. Welcome to our class on prayer. This is class number 4. And today, the title of our class is, I Have Sinned Greatly, David's Prayer of Confession. That's King David's prayer of confession, not mine. So the goal of our class, as we've talked about, is that we're clearly here studying prayer so that we can improve our prayer life. I'm going to play a little game, maybe because I have children. I'm keyed into this, but the why game, I like to ask why and drill down. Why are we trying to improve our prayer life? Well, you may say, well, because we're commanded to pray, and that's a very fine answer. But there's a reason, even further, why are we commanded to pray? And then within that, it opens up a spread of possible options. And it is our thesis throughout the class that by praying, you're going to improve your relationship with God as it's intended. Number 2, this is the avenue by which we connect with our Creator. We want to improve our prayer life, therefore, so that you can connect with your Creator. We want to improve our prayer life so you can strengthen your faith and walk. Okay, connect with your Creator. Improve your faith and your walk. And therefore, by studying this topic today on a prayer of confession, we are analyzing how it is we react in the face of sin. If you're confessing to God, you're confessing what? Your transgressions, right? And therefore, we are analyzing and scrutinizing how it is that you personally react when you sin. And it is therefore our thesis up front, bottom line up front, that if you remember God's promises and His covenants, and that if you humble yourself in prayer, you will be strengthened and you will be preserved. And that's our goal. Last week, we used the term breaking through this proverbial glass ceiling. If you feel stagnant in your faith, if you are cognizant of your mortality, knowing that you will die, and that life goes by in the blink of an eye, and you are wanting to advance in some way, maybe even you can't grasp what it is. How can I advance? I'm trying hard. I study my Bible. I come to church. I want to advance and grow. What does Paul say in Ephesians chapter 5? That a Christian, a child of God, is trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. So we have a life pursuing righteousness, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. And it is our submission to you that prayer will help you break through that glass ceiling. Daily meditation and a concerted, diligent effort to go to God in prayer and talk to Him, no matter what is going on in your life, is going to bring you closer to God, period. Okay? And so that's our thesis for the class. And I'll pick up where Daniel left off in his sermon. He says, there is hope no matter where you are in your life. I thought that was a beautiful ending to his sermon and the beginning of our class, because we're going to be talking about David and his prayer of confession this morning. So I won't make you raise your hand. The easy question is, who amongst us here has sinned? And we know that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Don't raise your hand to this, but just contemplate. Who among us here has sinned greatly? Do you know someone in your life who has sinned greatly? For yourself or someone you know, what was the result of that sin? How did you or the person you know respond in the face of that transgression? And what were the consequences? Okay, those are the things we're going to attempt to unpack as we study. Really, we're going to do a quick overview, even though we're studying the end of David's reign. We're really going to have to package it all within the story of who David is to understand the context of this final prayer. So we're going to see the difference between forgiveness, but the resulting consequences of that sin, and our relationship with God through that process. So by way of warm-up following that introduction, I want to talk briefly about the figures we've already discussed. We talked about Jacob wrestling with God, Moses making intercession on behalf of Israel, and Hannah pouring out her heart to God. And I ask you, what did these ancient figures understand about God that so profoundly shaped their prayers, their whole approach to life, and in some cases, when things got dire for them? What did they understand about God? That God is fully in control. Brian?
I would say it had a full faith and belief that God exists.
Okay, and that's important, especially if you understand all the other deities and religions of the world that even existed in this ancient world and that exist today. This wasn't this deity or God that was far removed from them and inaccessible. This was a God that these people understood had an intimate connection with them personally. That's a very important point, especially for us to make application today. What else, Daniel?
Along with that, God would. They had that confidence and trust that Brian was talking about in God, that He would do what He said He would do. That He's a God who makes promises. He's a God who keeps promises, and they had, that's where their faith rested.
They trusted in God. They trusted in His character. So they knew who God was. This was a point we kind of drilled down last week. Each one of these individuals knew God so well, they knew the character of God, and therefore when they went to Him in prayer, they understood who it was that they were talking to, which helped them sculpt the manner in which they spoke to Him, because they knew and trusted what God was capable of and what He was going to do for them. So much so, as we discussed with Hannah, when she was finished with her initial prayer of supplication, she left what? With her countenance lifted. As she went and ate, she was no longer downtrodden. The prayer hadn't been answered yet, but she left that prayer healed. Okay, so they trusted in God in a profound way. What else? Okay, I think that was good. Did I miss one? Okay, yeah. Thank you for that. They had a deep understanding of God as a personal, powerful, merciful promise keeper, as Daniel said. And this forms a backdrop for King David's own experiences and really for how he approached God when he sinned and faced the consequences of those sins. Okay? So the verse that we're going to read today is in 1 Chronicles 21, but I want you initially to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16. I want to recall, just by way of background, why it is that God chose David. And if you recall in 1 Samuel chapter 16, Samuel goes to Jesse because God told him to, and Jesse's sons pass before him, and he's going to anoint the one that God chooses. And notice in verse 7 it says, "But the Lord said to Samuel," 16 verse 7, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the" what? The Lord looks at the heart. And so why did God choose David to be the leader of Israel? Yes, that famous line, he's the man after God's own heart. And really, was David a perfect king? No, he wasn't. Actually, it's quite tragic in many ways, some of his story. Okay, but as I was reading this about the selection, that he was a man after God's own heart, I remembered Marty's lesson on wisdom that he gave when he was here. And he quoted from a verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 13. It says, "A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction." And one of the things I noticed just from the outset, before we even get into the story, is one of the things that sets David apart, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that when he made a mistake, you can see how David responds. He wasn't a perfect king. He made big mistakes. We said, who amongst us here has sinned greatly? King David, who's a man after God's own heart, sinned greatly. But how did he respond when he sinned? And that's the lesson for us, reading his story about how we can respond whenever we sin. Where did I take you? 2 Samuel. I'm sorry if I misquoted. That was 1 Samuel. I'm in 2 Samuel 16. But then he forms a covenant with him in 2 Samuel 7, he says, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This is God through Nathan to David. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men, but my loving kindness shall not depart from him. We talk about these characters understood the character of God. These men and women understood who God was. Well, who was God to them? A God whose loving kindness shall not depart from them. As I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Verse 16, your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. And so God forms this monumental, unbreakable pledge. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's my fault. But we're going to move on. Let it having been read from me. But it was in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and that was the covenant with David and God. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 13 through 17. That's my fault, Mike. Okay, so after facing various difficulties securing the throne, God promises David, hey, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. So he makes this pledge. And so what in this can we glean that David understood about God that shaped his life and his reign? Okay, Harrison, that he'd do what he said he'd do. Anything else? He had faith in God that he would do what? And not to bury the lead, but keep in mind, we have these same promises that David has. Daniel?
Well, the flip side of God's faithfulness is the reminder of Saul.
Mm-hmm.
Removed.
Okay. Right, so David knows God is faithful, that he is loving, that he is kind, that he's not going to depart from me, but he also knows God is just, okay, that there are consequences for sin. And I think that's important because David knows as he goes into his life how to behave whenever he sins. So we know that shortly after this, there's these jarring turns where David almost immediately commits adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his most valiant soldiers. To cover it up, he arranges for him to be deliberately killed on the battlefield, and there's sort of this fall from grace, or his reign wasn't what it could have been, let's put it that way. And there were consequences of that weren't slow in coming, but swift and clear. Okay? After that, prophet Nathanael directly confronts David and says, the sword shall never depart from your house because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. And David's response was with immediate confession. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has taken away your sin. You shall not die. So David is penitent. He's forgiven. He has not rejected God. But then you see sort of the story of him and the enduring consequences of his decision. There's a story of Amnon taking Tamar, his half-sister, this horrific act of violence. Absalom murders Amnon in revenge, and the family sort of spirals into chaos. Absalom rebels, and David is driven from Jerusalem, humiliated, and forced into this sort of civil war, and so on and so forth. in his kingdom. And so there's this sobering reality that someone can be totally forgiven by God, but still face substantive real world fallout. Okay. So with that, coming to the end of David's reign is, I ask you to turn, Mike, to 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And let's read the source text of today's class. And we're going to read the initial part. We're just going to call this Reading David's Sin. And then if I can get someone to read verses 1 through 8. Verse 8 is his prayer. Do we have a microphone? Someone can read verse 1 through 8 of 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Thanks, Justin.
Starting in verse 1. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the army, "Go, number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, and bring me a report that I may know their number." But Joab said, "May the Lord add to his people 100 times as many as they are. Are they not, my lord the king, all of them my lord's servants? Why then should my lord require this? Why should it be a cause of guilt for Israel?" But the king's word prevailed against Joab, so Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came back to Jerusalem. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to David. In all Israel there were 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and in Judah 470,000 who drew the sword. But he did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering, for the king's command was abhorrent to Joab. But God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. And David said to God, "I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing, but now please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly."
Okay. Look at that passage that we just read, review it over, and let's do some feedback on what you glean from that, David's response to his realization that he has sinned. First and foremost, what did David do that was wrong? Did you guys pick up on it? He numbered the people. What's wrong with that? Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it was explicitly stated or where it was, or if we have to infer that, but something about that census, he was warned, wasn't a good idea, right? And you could kind of bake into it and kind of glean maybe from the general's response, Joab's, maybe why that wasn't something that was good, and we can infer what the sin itself was. Joab's response, I think it was verse 3, said, "May God multiply our people." Joab wishes blessings on the nation and trusts in God to make Israel strong, not in the number. So there's this idea that David's coming in and he's numbering the people to count how mighty he is, to trust in these people himself instead of trusting in God. Joab says, "Aren't they already your loyal subjects?" So it implies that David should be content that the people are under his leadership. There's no need to count them to assess his strength. And he says, "Why bring guilt on Israel?" So Joab sees the census as spiritually dangerous, let's put it that way. So not an act of counting itself, but the why, perhaps, that David was counting. And so his motivation may be pride, self-reliance, lack of trust in God. But the class really isn't about what he did to sin. We almost could have read his prayer in a vacuum without the context of what led up to the sin. The idea was, I can tell you, David sinned greatly. He transgressed God. And give me some feedback about how David responded in verse 11. What do you see? Okay. Brian says, David took responsibility. I'm sorry, not 11, verse 8. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw Hannah refer to herself as a maidservant 3 times in her prayer, and then here's King David. There's like the all equalizing plane of the child of God is that we're all equal in our own transgression and sin, and therefore on bended knee before the Lord of hosts. So even David says, your servant. What else? Yeah, Beth says he doesn't downplay what his transgression was or try to make excuse or rationalize. And I think that one's really hard because the older we get, the more cunning our brains are at rationalizing and twisting our motives and explaining why it is we were justified in what we did. Even if we paint it as that was a transgression, but there's reasons I was there. So it can somewhat justify why I did what I did, right? Daniel?
Yeah. Words matter, and so when we have these euphemisms like I made a mistake, or we say I'm struggling with this sin, which we're really not struggling, we're losing, and we're not trying, but we say I'm struggling, meaning I'm sinning, and our words matter. When we say those things out loud to God, we're either diminishing the sin in our hearts, or we're giving it its proper weightiness, seriousness.
Yep, that's good. What about the brevity of this prayer? It's interesting to me that he's very to the point here, such that when he prays, it's not like he has to come in and convince God or speak to him, or you can do long form prayer, but here's an example of a very quick prayer that's to the point that says, I have sinned greatly and I have acted very foolishly, taking full ownership of it with humility. Okay, so in the introduction to our class, we talked about improving our prayer life for the purpose of growing closer to God and learning what is pleasing to the Lord. And if it is true that all of us are going to sin, this is a model prayer for us to remember as adults what to do when we sin. I think of it with our children. We're very good at teaching them how to act when they mess up. Children have an acute conscience. I remember when I was a kid, whenever I did something bad, you would get a pain in your stomach. You would feel bad. Not just the worry of the dad's belt, but you would feel guilty. And I realized, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but as an adult, unless you do something greatly, your conscience becomes a little callous the older you get. You may be aware intellectually and like from an academic standpoint that was a transgression, but that pain you feel, sometimes we lose that. David does not here. He knows he's acted foolishly. That word foolishly is one that's used specifically to describe the acts of Saul and his offering of sacrifices and specific instances where Saul acted foolishly. So in a sense, you could read this in the Hebrew and say, he's acting like Saul did. He's acting like a foolish king, not like God's chosen. Okay. So let's continue. If I can get someone to finish out, let's read verse 9 through 17.
Then the Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and tell David, saying, Thus says the Lord, I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and said to him, Thus says the Lord, choose for yourself either 3 years of famine or 3 months to be defeated by your foes with the sword of your enemies overtaking you. Or else for 3 days the sword of the Lord, the plague in the land, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now consider what answer I should take back to him who sent me. And David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are very great. But do not let me fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. And God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. As he was destroying, the Lord looked and relented of the disaster, and said to the angel who was destroying, It is enough. Now restrain your hand. And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. Then David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, having in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. So David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces. And David said to God, Was it not I who commanded the people to be numbered? I am the one who has sinned and done evil indeed. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, O Lord, my God, be against me and my father's house, but not against your people, that they should be plagued.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, just was as stated, when someone sins greatly, when we sin greatly, when we sin in small ways, there is judgment. There's a consequence. Regardless of our forgiveness or God's mercy, there is a resulting judgment. And so God grants three choices which decrease in length as they increase in severity. 3 years of famine, 3 months of devastation by his enemies, or 3 days of pestilence on the land. And we see that David chooses, instead of to be given over to his enemies, to man, to be put into the hands of man, he says, essentially, put me in the hands of God. David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are very great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. Okay, so he prays to God. He says, I've sinned greatly and that I have done this thing, but now please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. And then we move to the judgment. What can we glean from God's response and how David is praying here? This is essentially David's second follow-up prayer to God in response to the judgment. Well, what can we glean from this follow-up passage?
Well, first things, it's interesting that the discipline of the Lord did not fall upon David, but it fell upon those that he cared for. So David was spared, if you want to call it punishment or discipline, but his people were going to suffer greatly. I don't know that I understand David's first response, let me fall in the hands of the Lord, as opposed to fall into the hands of men. But later he says, let this thing fall upon me, for that people are innocent. But the punishment came upon the people.
Right. Any other thoughts on what Brian said or what you see, Daniel?
Well, just that oftentimes it's one and the same, at least for a person who has a pure heart, as David did. I mean, you hear story after story about a drunk driver who, has a car accident and people lose their life and they're just fine. But the consequences, they have to live with that guilt for the rest of their life. If it's almost like you'd rather be in the other position, right? So for David, especially as someone who cares so deeply about other people, to see innocent people suffer, knowing that it was because of him, right? But that's the way sin often works, whether it's the extreme case or not. Our sin affects other people, and we need to sit with that.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the main and important conclusions to reach from this is, and his story in comparison to our lives feels somewhat hyperbolic. Obviously, this is a king, this is a nation, 70,000 people lost their lives, but then we see David's response. What's his prayer? His prayer is, there's a huge consequence that's befalling this nation, and it's because of me. And what do we glean from that today? But that our sins have consequences. And if we're going to go to God in prayer initially to own up and say, your servant is here, I've sinned greatly, I have acted foolishly, whatever it may be, your walk is going to be strengthened. Your faith is going to be strengthened, period. Because you're going to humble yourself before Lord in that prayer, and you're going to go to God. And you know the character of God, that He is forgiving, and so you can approach Him. But then you know there's a consequence there. So we see David's example here to pray for the fallout of whatever may come if you sin greatly. And this is done to preserve you. Because what's the alternative if you don't go to God with that prayer? You're not praying to God for that. What are you doing? Yeah, and don't many men do, right? Like a rudderless ship. Become cynical, leave, face the consequences, blame it on other things, don't take ownership for it. And then you end up 30 years down the line, and it's so complicated how you even got there, you can't even grasp at what transpired to lead you there. You just know that you are in some sort of pit of hell and despair. People do it all the time. And that's why Christ is so magnificent to liberate people from that, because that confession and that humbling liberates us from this hell. Okay? We've had good discussion here, and we're going to continue to. I do want to get to the prayer journal. And so I want to talk for a moment and ask you a couple questions, and then I'll give you time to write, 10 minutes. How do you typically respond when confronted with your own wrongdoing? Okay. How can God's justice and mercy help shape your view of confession and repentance? And in your sin, how can you fall into the hands of the Lord rather than relying on your own strength? Okay? So, if it's okay with everybody, let's take 10 minutes and reflect on this story of confession. Use the time as you wish to write your prayer to God or your thoughts to meditate on this subject. And then we'll pivot to the conclusion of the class. Okay, we have about 4 minutes. I'm going to ask you to speak with your neighbors, those around you. We are not asking you to share what you wrote, unless you want to. But having taken some time to meditate on these things, let's talk about how this story helps us understand the nature of prayer, to improve your prayer life and what that means for you. I felt that was an interesting exercise here to write about this. It's sort of harrowing to think about. You know, you ask for God's mercy on your sins, but then knowing that God will be just is a harrowing thing to consider as well. But then from our vantage point, knowing Christ and His love and His sacrifice then wraps up this prayer that is very satisfying and comforting. So speak to your neighbors about your thoughts on this, and if we have a minute, we'll sound off. All right, guys. We went right up to the second bell. I would be remiss if I didn't add that at the end of this passage, the mercy of the Lord is evident in that He does stop the pestilence that came upon Israel and commands David to go and build an altar on the threshing floor of this individual here in verse 18 of our passage. And that altar becomes the site of the temple that will be constructed by Solomon. And so there's this poetic ending to the story of David and the mercy of the Lord, is that this place where we're separating the wheat from the chaff, He's going to go in and build an altar, and then the temple is going to be built here in spite of his sins and transgressions. And so we see this motif repeating even in our lives. So thank you for your attention today, and we'll continue on next week with, I think, Solomon's prayer for an understanding mind. Thanks.